East Hampton, Long Island. Just the name evokes images of pristine beaches, sprawling mansions hidden behind tall hedges, and a community where some of New York's wealthiest retreat to escape the city. It is a place where money buys silence, privacy, and beauty. To most people, the Hamptons are a symbol of success, a postcard version of the American dream. But in the fall of 2001, that dream was shattered inside one of its grandest estates. Behind the gates of a mansion built on power and privilege, a man who had everything, wealth, family, status, was about to lose it all in the most brutal way imaginable. His name was Ted Ammon, and his story is one of love gone sour, betrayal, greed, and ultimately, murder. To understand how Ted Ammon's life ended in bloodshed, you have to first understand who he was and how far he had come. He wasn't born into this world of hedge-lined estates and multi-million-dollar portfolios. Ted grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in a modest, middle-class household. He was born in 1949, a time when the city was known for steel mills and hardworking families. Ted wasn't destined by birth for greatness. But those who knew him as a boy would later say he had an intensity, a focus, that made him stand out. He wasn't flashy or boastful, but he carried with him a quiet determination that hinted he was meant for bigger things. After graduating from Bucknell University, Ted set his sights on the world of finance. He earned an MBA from Columbia Business School, stepping into New York City at a time when Wall Street was becoming the beating heart of wealth and power in America. The late 1970s and 1980s were the age of the dealmakers, men who thrived in high-stakes negotiations and lived for the adrenaline of corporate battles. Ted joined Kohlberg Kravis Roberts and Company, better known as KKR, a firm that would soon become legendary for pioneering leveraged buyouts. While others around him were loud and brash, Ted was different. He was steady, measured, a man who preferred results to rhetoric. His colleagues respected him as someone who could quietly cut through the noise and make things happen. The job made him wealthy, immensely wealthy. By his 40s, Ted was worth tens of millions of dollars, and eventually his fortune was estimated to be around $100 million. He moved with ease through the social circles of Manhattan's elite. He bought art, traveled widely, and eventually built himself a sanctuary in East Hampton, one of the largest and most impressive homes in the area. To anyone looking in from the outside, Ted Ammon was a man who had won life's game. But success is rarely complete without someone to share it with. In the late 1980s, Ted met a woman who would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Her name was Generosa Rand. She was beautiful, fiery, and had an intensity that matched Ted's ambition, though in a very different way. Born in Alabama and raised in California, she had the boldness of someone who had never been afraid to speak her mind. She worked as an artist and an interior decorator, and though her world was far removed from the boardrooms of Wall Street, she carried herself with confidence. She wasn't intimidated by Ted or his success. If anything, she challenged him. The chemistry between them was undeniable. Ted, who was known for his calm and composed demeanor, seemed fascinated by Generosa's volatility. She was outspoken, quick-tempered, and dramatic, and yet Ted married her. Perhaps he saw her passion as the spark his life of structure and discipline lacked. Whatever the reason, they became a couple, and soon after, they married and had twins, a boy and a girl. Together, they built their life around the East Hampton mansion. The property sprawled across acres, with manicured gardens, tennis courts, and lavish interiors designed to showcase their wealth. From the outside, it looked idyllic. The Ammons seemed to be the perfect family, spending summers by the ocean, raising their children in luxury, and enjoying the life Ted's hard work had made possible. Friends and neighbors saw them as a power couple, one of those marriages that represented the pinnacle of success. But inside the mansion, things were not as perfect as they seemed. Generosa's fiery nature, which had once captivated Ted, became a source of constant conflict. She was prone to explosive anger, shouting matches that could leave even close friends uncomfortable. Ted, for his part, often responded with silence. He was a man who thrived under pressure in the business world, but at home, the battles wore him down. Friends noticed how weary he seemed, as though the marriage had become less of a partnership and more of a storm he had to endure. Generosa grew increasingly suspicious of Ted, accusing him of infidelity, of neglect, of caring more about money than about her. Whether her suspicions were grounded in truth or fueled by her own insecurity, the result was the same: a home filled with tension. Ted poured himself into his children, finding comfort in being a father, while Generosa seemed restless and dissatisfied despite the wealth and privilege that surrounded her. As the years passed, the cracks in their marriage widened, arguments became routine, and the love that had once held them together eroded into bitterness. By the late 1990s, their relationship was teetering on the edge of collapse. Divorce was no longer a distant possibility, it was inevitable. And that divorce would not be simple. With so much money at stake, and with children caught in the middle, the stage was set for a battle that promised to be brutal. It was during this turbulent time that another man entered Generosa's life. His name was Daniel Pelosi, an electrician who came to work on the Ammon mansion during renovations. He was, in almost every way, the opposite of Ted. Where Ted was refined, educated, and polished, Pelosi was brash, rough, and unfiltered. He lacked Ted's sophistication, but he made up for it with an aggressive confidence that some found charming and others found obnoxious. For Generosa, who was already simmering with anger toward her husband, Pelosi was intoxicating. Their affair began quickly, and soon it was more than just a fling. Generosa flaunted her new relationship, making little effort to keep it hidden. To those who knew Ted, it was humiliating. Here was a man who had built a fortune, raised a family, and created a life of privilege, only to see his wife parade around with a man who seemed to thrive on chaos. The contrast between the disciplined banker and the hot-headed electrician was stark, almost surreal. Generosa, however, didn't seem to care. To her, Pelosi represented rebellion, freedom from Ted's world of order and control. He encouraged her anger, fed her resentment, and whispered promises of a new life where Ted no longer stood in the way. Ted remained focused on his children, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy even as his marriage publicly unraveled. But he wasn't naive. He knew the divorce looming ahead would be vicious. Generosa wasn't just walking away from the marriage, she wanted everything. She wanted the mansion, custody of the twins, and a huge share of Ted's fortune. The tension grew unbearable, spilling into every corner of their lives. Friends noticed Ted's exhaustion, the sadness behind his calm exterior. Neighbors noticed the spectacle of Generosa and Pelosi together, flaunting their relationship. The divorce proceedings promised scandal, but no one, not Ted, not his friends, not even Generosa herself, could have predicted just how dark and violent the story would become. By the year 2000, the once enviable marriage had turned into a war zone. The Hamptons mansion, once a symbol of Ted Ammon's success, had become the stage for betrayal and resentment. And in the shadows, Daniel Pelosi had already begun to imagine what life might look like if Ted Ammon was no longer part of the picture. East Hampton in October has a very different feel from its summer peak. The crowds are gone, the beaches are quieter, and the wealthy homeowners retreat behind their gates, enjoying a few more peaceful weekends before winter sets in. For Ted Ammon, the fall of 2001 should have been just another season at his mansion on Middle Lane, one of the most prestigious addresses in all of Long Island. Instead, it became the stage for one of the most shocking crimes the Hamptons had ever seen. By this time, Ted's life was in turmoil. His marriage to Generosa was collapsing in spectacular fashion. The divorce proceedings were ugly, dragging their private battles into courtrooms and legal filings. Generosa, with Daniel Pelosi now openly in her life, was fighting for custody of the twins and for a fortune that could change her future forever. For Ted, the stress was immense. He wanted to protect his children, preserve what he had built, and somehow move forward. But every step of the process was mired in conflict. Despite all of this, Ted remained a creature of routine. That October, he spent weekends at his East Hampton estate, often alone. The mansion was his sanctuary, a place where he could retreat from the chaos of his divorce, even if only temporarily. But it was also a lonely space now, filled with reminders of the family life that was slipping away. On the weekend of October 20th, 2001, Ted returned to the Hamptons as usual. Neighbors saw him around the property, and he spoke to a few friends, making plans for the upcoming week. Nothing seemed unusual. But on Sunday, October 21st, the estate fell quiet. Calls went unanswered, and no one seemed to see Ted. On Monday morning, October 22nd, concern began to grow. When Ted failed to show up for a business meeting in Manhattan, alarms were raised. He was not the kind of man to simply disappear without explanation. That afternoon, a friend decided to check on him, driving out to East Hampton. What he found inside the mansion was horrifying. Ted Ammon was lying dead on the floor of his bedroom. He had been beaten savagely, bludgeoned repeatedly until his life was gone. The brutality of the attack stunned investigators. This wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong. It was personal, violent, and enraged. The wealth, the prestige, the success, all of it had ended in a pool of blood on the polished floors of his mansion. Police quickly launched an investigation. In a community where violent crime was rare, the murder of a multimillionaire banker was headline news. The question was obvious. Who would want Ted Ammon dead? And the answer, at least on the surface, wasn't hard to imagine. The spotlight immediately turned to Generosa. She was in the midst of a bitter divorce, locked in a financial and emotional war with Ted. She had motive. Millions of dollars in custody of the children hung in the balance. She had anger. Friends and neighbors could attest to the venom in her words about her husband. And she had opportunity through the new man in her life, Daniel Pelosi. Pelosi was quickly seen as more than just Generosa's lover. To investigators, he became a prime suspect. He had a criminal record, a history of run-ins with the law, and a reputation for being volatile. Friends described him as someone who bragged, who liked to show off, and who often spoke recklessly. In stark contrast to Ted's quiet dignity, Pelosi seemed like a man who thrived on confrontation. The theory began to take shape. Pelosi, enraged by Generosa's hatred for Ted and perhaps motivated by the prospect of sharing in her wealth, had murdered Ted in his own home. But proving it would not be easy. Investigators combed through the mansion for evidence. The crime scene showed signs of a struggle, but there were no clear fingerprints, no weapon left behind, and no witnesses. Forensic work became crucial, but in 2001, DNA and crime scene technology were not as advanced as today. Detectives had to rely on interviews, alibis, and the tangled web of relationships surrounding Ted. Generosa's behavior after Ted's death only deepened suspicion. Instead of presenting herself as a grieving widow, she acted with anger and defiance. Within weeks of Ted's murder, she accelerated her relationship with Pelosi, moving him into her life more permanently. To those watching, it seemed less like mourning and more like a declaration. Ted was gone, and she had moved on. Then came the most telling detail of all. Generosa quickly secured her position in Ted's estate. With his death, she inherited a significant portion of his fortune, giving her and Pelosi access to the wealth they had once only fought over. To prosecutors, it seemed almost too clear. Generosa wanted the money and the freedom. Pelosi wanted the power and the lifestyle, and together they had eliminated the man standing in their way. But suspicion wasn't the same as proof. Investigators needed more than motive and opportunity. They needed hard evidence. And for a long time, that evidence was elusive. Pelosi denied any involvement. He claimed he had nothing to do with the murder, that he was being unfairly targeted because of his relationship with Generosa. She, too, maintained her innocence, lashing out at anyone who suggested otherwise. As the months passed, the case remained open but unresolved. Rumors swirled through East Hampton and Manhattan. How could a man of Ted Ammon's stature be murdered in his own home without someone being brought to justice? The lack of immediate answers only fueled public fascination. Behind the scenes, detectives continued to build their case. They looked at Pelosi's movements that weekend, trying to piece together his alibi. They listened to his phone calls, tracked his finances, and quietly pressured his associates for information. Little by little, a picture began to emerge. Pelosi, it seemed, had a habit of talking too much. He bragged to friends, made offhand comments, and behaved in ways that drew attention. In the months after the murder, he enjoyed the perks of being with Generosa, her wealth, her social status, her lavish lifestyle. But his arrogance became his weakness. Investigators gathered testimony from people who claimed Pelosi had hinted at his involvement in Ted's death. It wasn't a confession, but it was enough to keep the case alive. Meanwhile, Generosa's own life began to unravel. She was diagnosed with breast cancer, a cruel twist of fate that left her physically weakened even as the investigation intensified. Still, she clung to Pelosi, making him a central figure in her life, despite the storm of suspicion around them. Friends who had once stood by her began to distance themselves, unable to reconcile her choices with the tragedy of Ted's murder. By late 2002 and into 2003, the pieces were finally falling into place. Detectives had built a circumstantial but compelling case against Pelosi. They believed he had entered Ted's mansion on the night of October 20th, possibly with Generosa's knowledge, and brutally attacked him in his bedroom. The motive was simple: money and freedom. Generosa would inherit Ted's fortune, and Pelosi would share in it. In 2003, nearly 2 years after the murder, prosecutors made their move. Daniel Pelosi was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in the death of Ted Ammon. For the public, it was both a relief and a shock. Relief that someone was finally being held accountable. Shock that the story had confirmed what many had suspected all along: that Generosa and her lover had conspired in some way to end Ted's life. The arrest set the stage for one of the most sensational trials the Hamptons had ever seen. Wealth, betrayal, love triangles, greed, and murder. All the ingredients of a true crime saga were in place. For Ted's friends and family, it was a chance for justice. For the public, it was the continuation of a story that seemed pulled straight from the pages of a thriller. But as the trial loomed, one lingering question remained. How much of a role had Generosa herself played? Pelosi was the one facing charges, but many believed she had been the mastermind. With Ted gone, she had everything she wanted. And yet, with her health failing, it was unclear if she would ever stand trial or even live long enough to face consequences. The tragedy of Ted Ammon's murder was no longer just about the loss of a wealthy banker. It was about the destruction of a family, the corruption of love, and the poisonous combination of money and rage. East Hampton had been shaken to its core, and the story was far from over. The trial of Daniel Pelosi was one of those rare courtroom dramas that felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a stage play, complete with betrayal, scandal, and personalities that seemed larger than life. For nearly 3 years after Ted Ammon's brutal murder, whispers and speculation had swirled through Manhattan and the Hamptons. Everyone knew who the likely culprit was, but it wasn't until 2004 that the public would finally see the evidence laid out in a courtroom. The prosecution's case was built on a mixture of circumstantial evidence, testimony from Pelosi's associates, and the undeniable motive. They argued that Daniel Pelosi, fueled by greed and by his relationship with Generosa Rand, had entered Ted's mansion on that October night in 2001 and bludgeoned him to death. The brutality of the crime, prosecutors said, was consistent with a personal vendetta, not a random burglary. And who, they asked the jury, had more reason to want Ted Ammon gone than the man who was living with his estranged wife, enjoying his money, and resenting the man whose shadow he could never escape? Pelosi's defense team pushed back hard. They painted him as a convenient scapegoat, targeted because he was the rough-edged outsider who didn't belong in the world of East Hampton mansions and Wall Street millionaires. They emphasized the lack of direct physical evidence: no fingerprints, no DNA, no murder weapon tied conclusively to Pelosi. Without those, they argued, the case was built on gossip and character assassination. But what hurt Pelosi most wasn't forensic science. It was his own mouth. Over the years, he had made statements to friends and acquaintances that prosecutors used against him. He had bragged, hinted, and made offhand remarks about Ted's death, weaving just enough incriminating language to raise eyebrows. On the witness stand, these people recounted conversations in which Pelosi seemed to relish the power he had over Generosa and the fortune she inherited. Generosa herself, however, would never take the stand. By the time Pelosi went to trial, she was already gravely ill. Breast cancer had ravaged her body, and though investigators strongly believed she had orchestrated or at least encouraged Pelosi's actions, her declining health meant she would never face charges. She died in 2003 at the age of 46, still publicly defiant, still insisting she was innocent, but leaving behind an enduring cloud of suspicion. Her death left the trial with a ghostly absence. Generosa was the center of the story, the figure whose anger and greed had set the entire tragedy in motion. Yet in the courtroom, she was only present in the shadows, through testimony and photographs, through the memories of those who had watched her relationship with Ted disintegrate. It was left to Pelosi alone to answer for the crime. As the weeks dragged on, the jury listened to a parade of witnesses. Some described Pelosi's violent temper, his jealousy, his crude remarks about Ted. Others spoke of Generosa's rage during the divorce, her obsession with money, her desire to see Ted humiliated. Piece by piece, the prosecution painted a picture of a conspiracy fueled by hatred and greed. Even without Generosa on trial, her presence loomed over every word. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the outcome seemed uncertain. The lack of hard physical evidence gave the defense hope. But in the end, it was the weight of Pelosi's character, his own reckless words, and the sheer logic of motive that swayed them. In December 2004, Daniel Pelosi was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. The verdict brought a measure of closure, but not peace. For Ted Ammon's friends and family, nothing could undo the brutality of his death. For his children, the twins who had once played in the gardens of that East Hampton estate, the tragedy was even greater. They had lost their father to murder, their mother to illness and suspicion, and their home to scandal. They were orphans in the cruelest sense, left to navigate life with the burden of a story that would follow them forever. After Generosa's death, custody of the children became a matter of great concern. Generosa, in her final days, had tried to ensure that Pelosi would play a role in their lives, even going so far as to name him in guardianship papers. But the courts rejected that idea swiftly. The children were eventually placed with relatives, shielded as best as possible from the public eye. For them, privacy was the only gift that could still be given. As for Daniel Pelosi, his life behind bars was a far cry from the swaggering arrogance he displayed on the outside. He continued to protest his innocence, filing appeals and giving interviews from prison. In those interviews, he often shifted blame, suggesting conspiracies or claiming prosecutors had twisted the facts. But the conviction stood, and with it, his fate was sealed. The East Hampton mansion where Ted Ammon had been murdered was eventually sold, its glamorous facade forever tainted by the violence that had occurred within its walls. For neighbors, it was a chilling reminder that even in the wealthiest, most beautiful corners of America, darkness can thrive behind closed doors. The story of Ted Ammon's murder is more than just a tale of crime and punishment. It is a cautionary saga about how love can sour into hatred, how wealth can breed entitlement and greed, and how the pursuit of power can destroy not only lives but entire families. Ted had built a fortune through intelligence and hard work, but in the end, his greatest vulnerability was not in business. It was in the people he chose to trust. Generosa's fiery personality, which had once attracted him, became the spark that burned everything down. Pelosi's arrogance and violence turned suspicion into reality, and the children, innocent from beginning to end, became the most tragic victims of all. Looking back, the Hamptons murder remains one of the most haunting cases of early 2000s America. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime or the wealth and status of the victim. It was the human story underneath. A marriage filled with love and promise that dissolved into bitterness. A woman who wanted more than what even immense wealth could give her. A man who wanted to insert himself into a world he could never truly belong to. And in the middle of it all, a man whose life ended in silence, on the bedroom floor of a mansion he had once considered his sanctuary. Ted Ammon's legacy now exists in pieces. For some, he is remembered as the brilliant financier who helped shape Wall Street in its golden era. For others, he is the tragic victim of a domestic war fueled by greed and jealousy. But for his children, he is simply the father they lost too soon, the man taken from them not by fate, but by human cruelty. As time has passed, the story has faded from the headlines, but in East Hampton, on Middle Lane, the memory lingers. The mansions still stand, the hedges are still perfectly trimmed, and the ocean waves still crash on the beaches. But for those who remember the fall of 2001, the Hamptons are not just a playground for the rich. They are also the site of a brutal reminder that money cannot buy safety, and that even in paradise, darkness can find its way in. And that is the story of Ted Ammon, the rise of a man from Pittsburgh, the marriage that promised everything and delivered only bitterness, the brutal murder that shocked the Hamptons, and the trial that finally brought justice, though never healing.